Allow me to introduce Dr. Michelle King. Dr. King is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, working on modern Chinese food and gender history. She is co-editor of Modern Chinese Foodways, published 2025, editor of Culinary Nationalism in Asia, published 2019, and author of Between Birth and Death, Female Infanticide in 19th Century China, 2014. Today she'll be speaking about her newest monograph, Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, Food and the Making of Modern Chinese Food, published 2024 by W.W. Norton. This has been recognized as one of the best books of 2024 by New York Times and NPR. It's received support from a National Endowment for Humanities, which we were just lamenting is no longer possible for this kind of project. But really, it's received a number of accolades, and we are very lucky to have Professor King. Please join me in welcoming Professor King.
Thank you, James, for that generous introduction, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to the Taiwan Studies Program for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to share with you about my book. What you're looking at here are both the English, the original English, and then last year it came out in Chinese in Taiwan. So I was really nervous and excited to have to give interviews in Chinese in Taiwan. I practiced really hard. But that was a great experience because I got to hear what people in Taiwan actually thought about my book. But before I actually begin, I just wanted a little show of hands. How many of you have heard of or know who Pei-mei is? Yay, I'm talking to a crowd that knows. I'm assuming the people watching at home also have some idea who she is. And if not, by the end of this talk, you will have a much better idea of who Pei-mei is. So I don't need to tell all of you, right? The way that Taiwan is understood by most Americans is always within the shadow of China. I had to send this talk a week ago to your tech people so it could be online. But were it today, I'd have a different set of headlines all having to do with Trump and Xi Jinping and how they talk about Taiwan and what they ate for dinner and everything else. But these were just some examples of headlines that I clipped. And it's clear and obvious that for most Americans, Taiwan is always between the shadow of the United States and China. And one of my aims of my project is to talk about all the other aspects of life in Taiwan. It doesn't just exist simply as this shadow state between China and the United States, but there are 24 million people there who are eating food, enjoying life, dreaming, all kinds of other things is going on. And part of what I wanted to bring to life for people is this rich and abundant social history of modern Taiwan. But there's another way of thinking about and talking about why I wrote this book. As academics, we always talk about and justify the thing after we've written it. So anyway, this is my sort of post facto justification for why I wrote the book is when we look at all the titles, recent titles about Chinese food published in English in the United States, we can see some general patterns. Right? I usually ask for volunteers from the audience, what kinds of observations you have about all of these recent titles about Chinese food in the United States? Volunteers. Anyone want to volunteer? Yes. Go ahead.
It all looks Cantonese.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it looks Cantonese to me.
Oh, it all looks Cantonese. Yep. Other observations just about the covers? Yep. In the back? You have your hand up?
I was going to second that.
Okay. Yep.
Chop suey appears over
Chop suey everywhere. Yes.
It doesn't look authentic.
Doesn't. Oh my God. There's nothing authentic. All right. Yep.
I was to say a lot of red.
A lot of red, right? So chop suey, a lot of red. Someone says it looks Cantonese, like it's Cantonese. Right, so one of the things I talked about with my editor when designing my book cover was no red, no chopstick font, no takeout boxes, no sort of markers of what we think of as Chinese food in the United States, because just like President Trump just mentioned, most people only think of Chinese food as a restaurant phenomenon, and for me that's just never the way I experienced it. It was always a home cooking thing. And so part of what I wanted to do is disrupt this narrative that is only about Chinese food in the United States as a phenomenon of restaurants, right? I wanted to talk about home cooking. And why did I want to do that? Part of that is because I am a scholar of gender. And when we talk about home cooking, we can't not talk about women. And when you have all these sites that are only about restaurants, it's so easy to ally the contributions and work of women in talking about Chinese cooking. So that was one of my big inspirations for talking about home cooking, is that I want to talk about women and women's experiences, right? And if you go to the kitchen in the post-war period, you will find women. So that's another reason for doing this. But apart from, geopolitical reasons and apart from having reasons having to do with the existing scholarship, I had a very much more personal reason for writing this book, and that is my own family. Because my parents emigrated to the United States in the 1960s. They met on the campus of the University of Minnesota, and where they fell in love. And then they moved to a small town in Michigan where I and my siblings grew up. And that is me as the baby there. We're having what I would call a typical Chinese American meal.
Oh my God.
It's hamburgers with no buns, baked potatoes, peas, and a beautiful Jello salad with some I don't know what it is in the middle. I think this must have been my sister's birthday, and it was her request of a meal. And part of the reason I wanted to show this was because I grew up with Pei-mei's cookbooks. They were on my mom's cookbook shelf. I would look through them as a kid, because as you will see, they have these glorious Technicolor photos, and I would look through them. She would take them out whenever she would make, like dinner for guests or whatever. And as I was growing up, I always thought of my mother as an excellent cook, right? She was known for this. All the other aunties in the small town that I grew up in, all the Chinese other women, everybody competed to have their, favorite dishes. Potlucks and everything were a extensive affair in our when I was growing up, and it never occurred to me that my mother, when she first came to the United States in the 1960s, had no idea how to cook. She subsisted on peanut butter, boiled eggs, and tang, instant tang, right? She didn't know how to cook, and what I found was that her story was true of many women who were coming to the United States in those years, because her family had told her they just wanted her to focus on her studies. They didn't want her in the kitchen. And cooking was a matter of necessity because she married and had a family, and suddenly this was her responsibility, right? For what I really wanted to emphasize and underscore throughout this whole book is the idea that cooking is an act of will, right? It's not some kind of inheritance that Chinese people somehow, standing at your mother's knee or something like that, you just imbibe through drinking, beef noodle soup or whatever. No, it's an act of will. And that act of will is something that women have had to do, like it or not, good at it or not, right? And a book like Pei-mei's cookbook is one of the ways that they were able to learn how to do this, right? Because my mom, when she came in the 60s, there was nobody to teach her. How is she gonna learn, right? So one of the ways that she learned through trial and observation, as well as, using a cookbook like Pei-mei's. So for those of you who don't know about Pei-mei's cookbook, it's iconic, right? If you know it, you recognize the covers. For people of a certain age, you all know all the people in this audience probably know what this cookbook looks like. She wrote many more cookbooks besides this iconic 3-volume series. But the first volume in particular is one that people know about, but all of the cookbooks are bilingual, right? That is the way they were originally designed. That is the way they were originally published. So all of them have the Chinese on the left, the recipe in English on the right, and this they have these great color photos. This one happens to be the Songshu Huangyu recipe, and here's her version. You can see it actually has raisins on it, which is kind of weird. And you can see the dates of publication of volume 1, 2, and 3. It spans a very crucial period in Taiwan's history, right? When there's going to be a massive shift away from Taiwan to recognition of the PRC, and we see that even within the covers of her cookbook, as we're going to see. So this is what, when I was a kid, I would flip through, and I remembered this, right? That they had, all these English recipes, because when I was growing up, I didn't read Chinese, so I could only read the English part, and I didn't, come to learn Chinese till later. So all I knew about Pei-mei when I was growing up was I knew from the cookbook, the Pei-mei is so in your face, right? That's the only thing I knew about this woman, was Pei-mei was her name, right? And then I also knew, there's her pretty picture on the back. That's all I knew about her, didn't know anything else. I didn't know, for example, that she had hosted her own program on Taiwan television for 40 years, which is probably some kind of record. I've never looked it up, but probably one of the longest lasting, cooking show program hosts probably in the world. And it wasn't until I had my own kids that I went back to looking at Fu Pei-mei's cookbooks, because I wanted to learn how to make Chinese dishes for my own children. I was looking for something simple, right? In college, my mom had given me a set of her, or at least the first volume. And so I went back to it and looked back through it again. Only this time when I went back to look through the cookbook again, I noticed that not only were there these recipes that I remembered, not only were there these color photos, there were also things like this picture in particular of all the newspaper clippings about her travels all around the world. And as a historian, because by then I had been trained as a gender historian of modern China, I saw those clippings and I said, aha, maybe this is something worth pursuing. Maybe there's a story that can be told here. And I also saw these black and white photos. Here she is meeting Jiang Jingguo, right, meeting all these VIPs. There were other photos of her teaching foreign students how to cook Chinese food. So in putting it all together, I realized that in fact, not only was there a story to tell, there was a great story to tell, right? That she was basically a figure like Julia Child. In 1971, New York Times food writer called her, in fact, the Julia Child of Chinese cooking. Later, I wrote an article that argued that Julia Child should really be known as the Fu Pei-mei of French cooking, because in Taiwan, everything is measured by Fu Pei-mei, right? So other cookbook authors and educators would come to Taiwan, and in the newspaper articles, you would say, she is known as the Fu Pei-mei of Finland. This woman is known as the Fu Pei-mei of England, right? The same way that everyone is compared to Julia Child, she's the stand-in for cooking person, expert, par excellence. And you can see they really overlap. They died in the same year. They both had major cookbooks. They were both on television for a very long time. I'd like to say that, Fu Pei-mei actually preceded Julia Child on television just by a few months, but still. But you can see they have really parallel kinds of career trajectories in a lot of ways. But there are also some important differences as well. One of the questions is, why does Fu Pei-mei come to be of prominence in Taiwan when she does? Like, why does it matter? Julia Child came to prominence kind of in the 60s, right? This is a time of Camelot, and there's this fascination with France, and middle-class America wants this feeling of like a little sophistication in the things they're making for their family and friends, so French cooking makes sense, right? That's what she's teaching to American housewives. But then the question is, why do we need a Fu Pei-mei to teach Chinese cooking to Taiwanese housewives? Don't they already know how to cook? Yes, they do, but not quite, right? And the not quite part is that, of course, as you all know, after 1949, all these refugees are coming to Taiwan from all over different parts of China. And suddenly, now on the little island of Taiwan, all these mainlanders are rubbing elbows with other mainlanders who have very different ways of eating, right? So now you see how the people from Sichuan, how the people from Jiangsu eat, how the people from Fujian eat, in addition to how the people in Taiwan already are eating. And suddenly people want to know, how do I make that dish, right? Or how do I surprise and entertain my guests and friends with different ways of cooking that people aren't used to? So that's part of the reason that she comes to prominence in the first place. Because in her first cookbook, she divides her cookbook into regions by cardinal direction. And her claim to fame is that she learned how to cook not just one Chinese regional cuisine, but that she took lessons basically from a number of different chefs from different Chinese regions and mastered, if not all, many, many different kinds of Chinese regional cooking. So that's what she could demonstrate on television for everyone, right? So that was part of the reason for her fame in Taiwan. So in learning more about Taiwan, I realized this is a great figure through which to tell the story of modern Taiwan, right? So we don't just talk about food, but there's all these other topics that I cover in my book. Today I'm going to talk about two aspects. One of them is the domestic front in terms of her being on television and media in Taiwan. And the other is through her cookbook and kind of the foreign relations side of things. So I want to just talk about those two different things. I'm happy to answer questions about any of these topics. I could go on and on about any of them for a long time. So anyway, if anyone has questions later, I'm happy to talk about any of that. But I want to focus on both the domestic side for this audience in particular, and then also some of this other side as well. So as you can see, this is from Taiwan Television, their like TV Weekly, basically. You can see that the spread of television in 1962 was not very much. Basically, just a little edge, northern edge of Taiwan. That's about it. They didn't get any broadcast service down in the south. There was only one channel. You didn't need a channel selector on your TV because there's only one channel to watch anyway. And this is the way that the old TVs looked. They stood on legs. It was all black and white. You can see I Love Lucy is a favorite program that's being shown at the time. So I paged through many years worth of TV guides to find out more about Fu Pei-mei. She debuted, one of the reasons she's so interesting as a figure to talk about so many things is that she debuted on TV in Taiwan the year it started, the medium itself, in 1962, right? Which is cool. Not the very first day, but within the first couple of months, she was on television. By 1962, she had already established her own cooking school, and that's kind of how she got this chance to be on TV in 1962. Some of her students kind of recommended her to a producer, but you can see it's a very bare bones initial outing onto TV, right? It's basically a wooden, countertop. All of the materials, all the sauces, the bowls, the spoons, the wok, everything else she brought from home, including they supplied her with nothing, right? And she had to bring everything with her. And on the day that she debuted, she actually forgot her cleaver, right? Which was hugely problematic because I'm going to show you the dish that she debuted was how to fillet and make a fish, squirreled fish, but you have to cut it in a certain way. So she had to run to the cafeteria of the television station to borrow a cleaver and then do it on television. It was all live. There's no recordings of her. So unfortunately, we can't see the earliest recordings. There's only a video from her basically from the 80s. Before that, there isn't any Taiwan television record, unfortunately. But you can see the thing that she's cooking on. Have any of you ever cooked on this? Do you know what it is? It is not gas. It is not electric. It's charcoal. It's charcoal. She's cooking on a wok with live charcoal in that, brazier. Basically, that's how Taiwanese housewives of the time cooked, and that's how she did it. And that's the even more amazing thing. It's like, even with all the equipment, I could never turn this out. But she did it in 20 minutes with live charcoal. I'd like to show this as a comparison between the setup and support that Julia Child had versus what Fu Pei-mei had, right? But the interesting thing is this is a real live test kitchen that Julia Child got to work in, live, running water, electricity, all the appliances, modern, kitchen, and all these support staff behind her. But the thing that she debuted when she first came out on television was an omelet. What did Fu Pei-mei debut in this really rudimentary, very basic setup was her squirreled fish dish, right? A breaded, fried dish with a sauce in 20 minutes on live charcoal. Right? That's the difference, right? So, which is, I think, really telling. One of the interesting things that I found in doing my research was that Fu Pei-mei was by far not the only host at the time for the women's cooking program. There were, in fact, many, many other women who rotated in and out of that role. You see this more grandmotherly type, some of the dishes. She actually was on the program the most that first year. Fu Pei-mei was on it as much as another woman with 19 appearances. Another woman was a Western dessert expert. Right, there were a couple of these Western dessert experts, and one of the really interesting things I found was that not only did women, housewives of the time, want to learn how to cook regional Chinese cuisine, the other thing they really wanted to know was how to bake Western desserts, right? Because they said, Westerners, they don't really know how to cook food very well, but they know how to bake. And the baking part is the part that was like, you could ooh and ah, or you could impress your guests with like a birthday cake with frosting, right? Or banana bread, for example, right? So it's really interesting that that was what counted as modern. And the ingredients were actually not so easy to get as well, because dairy isn't a normal thing for most Chinese cooking. So you see here is a very young Pei-mei, through the first year, showing all these different dishes. And I think what's really interesting is that what she very quickly, within the first couple of years, became the figure for Chinese cooking on Taiwan television. And why is that? I think, what I could tell from the magazines was that they would praise her for speaking Mandarin, Japanese, Taiwanese, and other dialects. I don't think her Taiwanese was actually that great, but she also spoke some English. But, this is Taiwan television, so they want to promote a unified vision and idea of what Taiwan is, right? So she really does represent that kind of, mainlander ideal and idea of what China is at the time. But the other thing that I noticed that she's really good at is not just that her knife skills or her hand skills, she can talk, right? So to be a good cooking instructor, you can't just know the techniques. You have to be able to talk and cut and chop and do it all at the same time and make it interesting, right? If you just, when I was watching some of the programs from the 80s, she had some guest chefs on, and they would just move their hands. They would never say anything, they'd be too nervous. And so she would ask them questions to get them to talk, right? It's actually not a very easy skill to be able to do those things and to do it well and to show people, how to make these dishes in a clear way. And so that is part of what made her so beloved. But you can see, over the years and over the decades as she grew into this iconic figure, always or very often wearing a qipao and always wearing an apron of some kind. She had a collection of like over 300 aprons. She always had her hair done nicely. And, she looks like your mom or your grandma, as you wish your mom or grandma to be. Because as later after her death, her fans would write in to the newspaper remembering her. And one of them said she was always dressed in a qipao with a matching apron. Her hair was always done up nicely. She was certainly quite distinct from the figure of my own mother in the kitchen, with her messy hair and grubby face battling against the oil and smoke. And I love that idea because, there's just this idea of her as some kind of idealized figure of maternal figure, right? That's another part of her appeal. Which is really interesting, especially at a time when women in Taiwan are stepping away from the kitchen to go into the workforce, right? One of the really interesting stories that I can also tell through Pei-mei is the change in gender roles in Taiwan, because at the start of her career, she's teaching women how to cook Chinese dishes in their homes for their families because they need to and want to learn. By the end of her career, she can't fill her cooking school, because there's all these other ways of eating in Taiwan. Who needs to go cook, right? Now you just go out on the street to eat, or you're too busy as a working woman. You don't have time to make these elaborate dishes and stuff. So I thought that also tells a very interesting arc about gender. But one of the things I really loved was finding a series of essay competition sort of celebrating the first anniversary, 5th anniversary, 10th anniversary of the founding of Taiwan television. And so they would have these reader essay contests. And in 1967, at the 5th annual essay contest, they had a housewives division. And this woman wrote a whole essay about how Pei-mei was basically like their friend, right? And that everybody, because not everybody had a television, it was still quite special and expensive. So everyone, all the women in the neighborhood on Wednesday nights would come to her house, bring all their treats, and they would have someone take notes, right, that she would later share with everyone. But I love this image because it's like this communal idea of watching television together and having it be this community building activity, so that all the women in this neighborhood eventually have their own television banquet where they make dishes for the entire neighborhood based on all the stuff that they've seen on the cooking program. right? And today, we're so used to thinking of media as like this isolating, on your own thing that you just do on your phone. But at the time when television debuted, people really experienced it as this communal thing, which I thought was really interesting. And here she is, I told you about the Western desserts, they featured all this, they have special advertisements for all the baking implements, because most, apartments or homes would not have been equipped with an oven. So, to buy an oven, measuring spoons, whisks, all these other things. And this is supposedly the debut of having a foreigner on television. This is a woman, she's probably the wife of a military, US military person. I don't know exactly who she is, but she demonstrated how to bake banana bread, which Pei-mei claims that after this debut, like the bakeries in Taiwan all went nuts for banana bread and everybody wanted to learn how to make it. So I wanted to show you a little clip of her. This is her, probably in the 1980s. And this is the dish that she made when she debuted, right? This is the songshu huangyu dish. Then I'll show you a little bit. It's about a minute or so. So that's, and it's all in Chinese, but I also wanted to show you this other clip. Is this it? I don't understand that. Yes, that's the point. She it does not speak Tagalog, but that is basically what Taiwan Television sold the rights to her program to the Philippines. It was dubbed into Tagalog, and she's very popular in the Philippines as well, right? Because they would broadcast her program, after a particular popular program. So when I first started doing this research, there were no videos of her on YouTube except ones in Tagalog. That's all I could find. And it was fascinating to me to fall down this rabbit hole of like, how is her work popular in the Philippines? But as I found out, she traveled around the world demonstrating Chinese cooking to all kinds of different audiences. We can see she had a program in Japan. She spoke Japanese fluently because she grew up in Dalian when it was an occupied city in World War II. So actually all of her schooling was in Japanese. So she had a love affair with Japan. She would go there to record this program that she had on there in the late 70s and 80s, which was to teach Japanese housewives how to cook Chinese food. But she also went to Korea. Here she is in the Philippines. She went all over Asia, and she also traveled to the United States several times, South Africa, Australia, the Netherlands, many, many places, right? So she was known in Taiwan as a culinary ambassador, right? So in a way, she embodies not just the domestic side, literally the domestic side with women and housework and everything else, but also this kind of appropriate for the Jackson School, this foreign relations side where although she was not an official employee or anything of the ROC government, they knew that whenever foreign journalists would come and they wanted to send them to talk to somebody about Taiwan's culture or whatever, they would send her to Pei-mei, right? So she would go with to international book fairs and promote her book. She would talk up, Taiwan's bountiful products, like their sauces or their vegetables or whatever, right? So you can see that as well, that she occupies this other position, kind of as a culinary ambassador. Here she is in Australia, for example. She judged a competition that was sponsored by the Australia Meat and Livestock Association to promote the use of Australian meats in Taiwan amongst housewives. Right, so she would use, she'd be a shill basically and say, hey, use this lamb, use this, other cuts or whatever that maybe Taiwan's housewives weren't used to. So the, requisite kangaroo photo there. And what's really interesting is the way that her ambassadorship is written about in the Taiwan press, right? Because the press in Taiwan is saying, look at all this wonderful work that she's done as a PR thing, as a foreign relations thing. She's appearing on the front covers of all these English language newspapers in the Philippines, for example, right? reporting on the enthusiastic participation of Filipino Chinese women in all her classes and studies. This is a successful example of people-to-people diplomacy through food. Now, what I find so interesting is when I went back to track down all of those English language newspapers in the Philippines, you can see that there is nary a word about Taiwan in any of this, right? All of the people who are watching and listening to her, maybe they know she's from Taiwan, maybe they don't know the difference, right? For most people who were watching, she's just a Chinese cook from wherever, teaching about whatever. So, you know, I think it just demonstrates kind of the difficulty Taiwan has even today in thinking about cooking and cuisine as a soft power tool, right? If people can't identify it, they don't know boba tea originates in Taiwan, right? They think of it as some Asian thing or Chinese thing, right? It's hard for that to be your tool of soft power if people outside can't identify it. So I thought that was also very interesting. And this was also really fantastic irony. This is her recipe for a sweet walnut soup that appears in the New York Times, right? What more could you say that your work has appeared in the New York Times, but what is it commemorating? It's the Nixon banquet, right? So Nixon going to China in 1972. What did they eat? You know, if you want to recreate some of those dishes, here's a recipe from her cookbook. So in a way, it's like the height of irony that her cookbook and her recipe is being used to talk about this, which is very timely considering today, Trump meeting with Xi Jinping, and they're talking about the banquet and everything they ate, right? They did that in 1972 as well. So really, really interesting. And really interesting to me that, you know, Chinese food is like a metonym for all things Chinese for Trump, right? That's it, that's all he knows. Anyway, all right, so talking about the other aspect that I think is really interesting, in her first cookbook, as I told you, she divided Chinese cuisine into 4 cardinal direction regions, right? North, south, east, and west, which correspond to different Chinese kind of large regional categories of eating that are still something that people definitely talk about today. Usually they talk about 8 great regional cuisines today, or 12, or, you know, the number is very malleable. But these are the maps that appear in that 1969 cookbook of, you know, highlighting the different regions, so Sichuan or Shandong or Guangdong or, you know, Jiangsu and Zhejiang. Anything strike you about these maps? It's like a trick question. Yes, anyone want to say?
Mongolia is included.
Mongolia is included. What is this a map of?
China.
It is a map of China as understood and interpreted by the Republic of China before it went to Taiwan in 1949, right? So the map that she's promoting is this basically fantasy map, right? That Taiwan no longer, the Republic of China no longer controlled any of these areas. But the map that was fixed in her head and the one that she's printing is a map of the Republic of China as, you know, kind of imagined in Taiwan after 1949, which I thought was also very interesting. So literally kind of foreign policy, if you will, but again, probably going over the heads of most Americans who, would they know the difference? Probably not, right? I have to ask my students, look very carefully, what do you see, right? Because they can't tell the difference between the PRC today and this map as understood by the Republic of China on Taiwan, right? And here are all these provinces that no longer exist, right? They've been absorbed into other provinces or given other names, or Mongolia is hived off to be another country, right? So quite a different looking map. Another aspect that we can talk about, though, in terms of her kind of foreign policy is not just her own travels abroad to talk about Chinese food and demonstrating it, but that it was sort of this a virtuous circle, because she had a cooking school in Taiwan. A lot of people in the 70s wanted to leave Taiwan. One of the ways they would leave Taiwan is by getting training in her cooking school, so then they could go abroad and open a Chinese restaurant, right? And they could boast about it. And a lot of, I searched through, you know, any American newspapers from that period, many of them will mention her cookbook. having taken lessons with her, so these are just some. Here's this woman in New Jersey. Here are people in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, who took classes with her before going there, right? Here is an ad for a restaurant in California where he boasts about being a graduate of the Pei-mei cooking school. Here is an American woman who was posted there. Her husband was there as a military advisor in Taiwan. She took lessons and then turned around and taught, Chinese cooking to American housewives, right? And she boasts that she studied with Taiwan's Julia Child, right? So in a way, her work lives on. And this was really interesting. This is not just a man, but he's like a sanitation worker, but he was so interested and so fell in love with Chinese cooking that he did everything he could to learn all he could from Chinatown in New York, but then spent 6 weeks in Taiwan just to take lessons with her at her school, right? So there's a lot of these examples of people getting very immersed. And I mapped out all the references I could find, with the ones in red being, Chinese immigrants who had come from Taiwan to the United States, and still mentioned in her book, and then white Americans who, because usually they have this connection with the military, were coming and teaching Chinese cooking to American audiences. And what is really interesting is the idea embedded within that food is going to be the vector through which we can understand each other and understand other cultures. In her first book, she had the wife of the then ambassador to the ROC, when the US still sent an ambassador to the ROC, who wrote, I congratulate Ms. Fu and trust that her book will further advance the friendship and interest between Chinese and American people. When she gave a speech in Los Angeles, Fu Pei-mei said that, by sharing our various cuisines, we can increase mutual understanding and friendship around the world. And yes, we see that, again, this idea that through food, we will get to know each other and understand each other. This is a political science teacher in Michigan who took classes with Fu Pei-mei and then turned around and taught his own college students how to cook the dishes that he had learned there, which include things like soy sauce chicken, fried wontons, fried rice, egg rolls, things like that, right? Things that maybe people would now say is not authentic, but were the things that, not only did he learn in the school, but, that students wanted to learn. And it's really interesting to me, this kind of hopefulness of this scenario, right? That he is convinced, he's a political science teacher, he's convinced that the teaching of foreign cuisines is an important factor in overcoming the mental blocks that Americans may have about foreign societies and in leading them to personal contact with foreign peoples, right? That through food, we will actually bridge some of these differences and people will get to know each other and their cultures. I thought about this a lot during the pandemic, when there were kind of anti-Asian, kind of racist incidents, and there were a lot of protests against those anti-Asian incidents. And the slogan that came forward, that went on pies and t-shirts and posters, is "Love our people like you love our food," right? Which is a really interesting idea, problematic in many different ways, but very interesting in the idea that that loving the food doesn't lead to, in fact, loving the culture and the people, and that there is a sense here with this slogan that that kind of ideal of through food we will get to know and love people and their culture, is a kind of a promise as yet unfulfilled. So I'm going to stop there, and I will welcome any of your questions for today's topic.
Okay, I wonder if there's some social change going on too. I thought when you very started with your parents arriving in Minnesota and your mother not knowing how to cook. And then you also brought up teaching people to cook in Taiwan. In many cases where I read memoirs and whatnot, back in the old days, they had servants at home. And so a perfectly good middle-class woman didn't cook because they had servants. And it could have even been a man doing the cooking. And maybe your mother didn't tell you, but maybe back home, there was a cook,
They
there was
did,
a
they had a
servant.
family cook, we talked about that, right? And so that's another aspect in that transpacific journey coming from Taiwan to, or even from China to Taiwan and then Taiwan to the United States. Indeed, you couldn't afford to have servants, and if you wanted to have Chinese food, nobody's gonna make it for you in the United States, right? So there's that. But there is also the aspect that, even though women in Taiwan, some of them, if you're in middle class or something, may have had,
I mean,
her
many of the,
servants.
let's say the ROC officials, they
Yes.
had probably had servants back home.
Yes, absolutely, yes, there is a social aspect of that as well. And one of the really interesting things is that, for example, in 2017, Taiwan Television had a kind of dramatic TV drama based on her life in part. It's called What She Brought to the Table. It's based on her autobiography, but it's not only based on her autobiography. There's also kind of this fictional element, and the fictional element tells the story of her Taiwanese housemaid, right, who does not appear in her autobiography at all. She never mentions a Taiwanese housemaid, but for today's Taiwan, you have to tell this story, not just a mainlander story, but also a Taiwanese story. And so that's how they get at that story in the contemporary kind of television treatment of that. And it's through the housemaid's perspective. But I have a section in my book about basically about housemaids and, about that whole aspect of managing life.
Yeah, the sort of official level on the mainland. Probably had a couple of servants.
Yes, very possibly. Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. As a linguist, I'm curious, you mentioned that language and translation is also part of this project. Would you mind giving us a hint about what you did?
Yeah, sure. So the really interesting thing is that the cookbook is bilingual in the first place. Like, why is it bilingual, right? Because she is simultaneously talking to an American audience of all of these military wives in the first instance, and also a domestic audience. And because it's in English, that's what gives it legs to travel around the world, right? There are many other cookbook authors in Taiwan at the time, but their work is never known or celebrated outside because nobody can read it. So that was super savvy on her part to make it English and Chinese. But what the really interesting part was when I looked at the cookbook was when we think of translation, right? We think of one-to-one correspondence, A and B, and matches up. But when you look and read the Chinese and the English, they do not match. In English, right? But if you don't know Chinese or you don't know English, you don't know the difference. It looks good to you, right? So I make a lot about like the ideas of what she tells her Chinese audience versus what gets transmitted to her American audience, right? And so there's many differences. Sometimes in the recipes there are differences, saying you can get this, talking about the ingredients you can get in Taiwan for the Chinese audience or the audience that is in Taiwan. And then here's a substitute you can use in the United States, right, for the American audience. But there's just this, a lot of things that don't get translated, especially in the first volume. In the subsequent volumes, she actually did have Americans who helped her that did know Chinese, so they're much more accurate. But, through the cookbooks themselves, you see what's changing, kind of. And if you look at, for example, even if you even look at the title of the book, let's see, oh, sorry.
Oh.
If you even look at the title of the book, It's called Pei-mei Shipu, but in English, it's called Pei-mei's Chinese cookbook, right? In English, you have to modify that it's Chinese. In Chinese, it's just Pei-mei's cookbook because what other cuisine would you be making? Right? The only time you need to modify it is if it's Western cooking, right? So there's all these, even in that very small thing, you see these differences. So I did a lot of work in like carefully reading through and seeing where are the differences, which things are the same, to basically say that also this moment of bilingualism is very short. Right, nowadays, you have cookbooks in Chinese, you have cookbooks in English. You don't have bilingual cookbooks anymore because you don't need bilingual cookbooks anymore. Who would that be for, right? What kind of audience is being imagined? Because you don't speak to two audiences at the same time. You have different kind of messages for different audiences. So I think that moment of bilingual, kind of this bilingual recipe making, which is something that others were influenced by her bilingual cookbook, and Wei Chen also had a bilingual cookbook. There were a couple of other examples of bilingual cookbooks as well. That moment and that window of this optimism is very short-lived.
I'll take a couple questions from online. So just a reminder, those who are joining online, you can leave comments either on Facebook or on YouTube. So first question from online is from Tiffany Rang. This is the local Taiwanese chef that I was mentioning earlier. Pei-mei has some descendants in Taiwan right now. Are they preserving their legacy somehow? Is there a place in Taiwan, an exhibit or something similar, where we can visit to learn more about her?
Yes, well, you can read my book is one way to learn about her. That's probably the most concentrated amount of stuff you'll ever want to know about her. But I recently went to the National Taiwan Museum of History, and they had a special exhibit, and they had some, small part about her, but it's not a permanent exhibit. But her children are actively kind of trying to maintain her legacy. So her son is a publisher, is a cookbook author herself, and they're very much trying to continue the legacy of their mother. But what's really interesting is I went to in 2014 was the 10th anniversary of her death. And so they had this kind of special offer in a lot of restaurants in Taipei where they kind of recreated her dishes. And what the really interesting thing was thinking about kind of this as a nostalgic version of Chinese food, right? This is how my parents cooked, or, it's like Chinese food in Taiwan has obviously evolved and changed since then. And so it's really interesting to think about how even her own children are kind of celebrating that nostalgic aspect of her cooking, not just this is au courant, this is how you learn how to cook Chinese food, but that it has this nostalgic aspect. So so that's how I would say that they are trying very much. They've re-released and reissued her cookbook. It's no longer available in print in that retro version I've shown you here. This is actually worth a lot, so if you have them at home, hang on to them. Yeah, you look online now, like sometimes it's a couple, like $100 or more or whatever to buy the cookbook, even more than that. So I like to think that my book promoted a secondary market. But yeah, anyone over a certain age knows who she is, but young people in Taiwan don't necessarily know who she is, which is really interesting, right? Because they've never seen her on TV. She retired in 2004. I had people come up to me in Taiwan and say, "Thank you for telling me about this woman I knew nothing about." And I'm like, "Great, this is part of history for you." But it's interesting to me because there's a complex relationship to how people think about her as an inventor today. So, yeah.
I'll take one more question from online and we'll go back to our in-person audience. So this is from Professor Wang, who's joining us from Japan. And she asks, I noticed the Datong electric pot on screen. In your research, have you noticed any transfer of culinary technologies around the world by Pei-mei? And this is a good question because the prized possession that my mother handed down to me is a 1980 Datong Dianguo,
Yes.
which I use more often than I thought I would.
Oh, all the time. Yep. That's why. So I had this artist do a rendering. Oh, I can't get to it this way. The last slide I showed you, I had this artist paint this painting to commemorate my finishing this book. It took me 10 years to write. So anyway, one of the things I wanted to put in there is a datong dianguo, which is, yes, absolutely iconic. I talk about that in one of the chapters of my book, the changes in kitchen technology. So not only are we talking about electric rice cookers, we're also talking about refrigeration. We're talking about gas stoves. We're talking about the microwave, right? People don't like to think about this, but when the microwave came along and they wanted to market it in Taiwan, they wanted to tell women that all of that smoke will go away. You never need to use a stove again. You have this magic stove that you can use. And of course, I think of a microwave as like heating up my tea or leftovers, right? I don't think of cooking in it. But when it was marketed at first in the 70s in Taiwan, it was like, it will eliminate all those odors and all those problems, and everything can be made in the microwave. So I even found like a menu for a 17-minute meal, a Chinese meal you can make entirely with a microwave. But yes, datong also took the technology, or was given the technology from Japan, and that's partly how this starts. But definitely the datong electric rice cooker is one of the iconic items. Every person of a certain age is going to recognize that, no fuzzy logic, just press the button, that's it. Put the water in, press the button, that's it. But there's many things, not just the electric rice cooker, but also food technologies. So like making of instant ramen. So one of the interesting things was that she didn't just cook, home cooking. She also consulted with food companies. So there's a very well-known ramen kind of flavoring packets that bore her name and her image for a long time, made by Tomi. Basically, they still make it today, they just don't have her name on it anymore. So there's a lot of aspects of kitchen and food technologies that kind of come into her story as well, which is something else I talk about in the book.
All right, back to in-person. I think there were a couple hands up in the middle, which I'll take. And if you speak up, actually, I don't have to repeat your question. I've been told by Nevi, our microphone will pick it up. So maybe on the left first, and then Edie. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, okay. You spoke a little bit to the question of nomenclature. In Pei-mei's books, it's the Chinese cookbook. And in part, I take your point that it's reflective of multiple Chinese regional cuisines that then went to the ROC. And in part, you gesture at how that is a way to make Chinese food or Taiwanese foods legible and intelligible to a Western audience. Can you talk a little bit about your choice, the title of this talk and the title of your book
Yes.
reflect that as well?
Yes.
Are you just taking cues from Pei-mei, or I'd be interested
Yes,
to hear
yes.
about that.
I thought about it and talked about it with my editor. Should I put Taiwan in the title? Should I call it Taiwanese? She herself doesn't call herself Taiwanese, right? In that time and era, Taiwanese would have meant a person that spoke Taiwanese, and that's not her, right? So partly I say, well, I'm using the language that she uses, right? Because that is what she's articulating, is a vision of the ROC as a representative of all of China. You can see it from the maps, right? But I do have a whole chapter that talks about the articulation of identity, how that's changed, how people articulate their identities as a changing thing. I spoke with some cookbook author, Clarissa Wei, who has written a really great cookbook called Made in Taiwan. She completely rejects the use of Chinese, as do other people. As a historian, I think, well, this is still part of Taiwan's history, right? It's not that it isn't part of it anymore. It's just that, there's a lot of debates and talks about, what constitutes Taiwan's modern history. I choose Chinese partly because that's also how I grew up. My parents are mainlanders, right? My parents always considered themselves to be Chinese. My mom and I have arguments today about, about what should happen with Taiwan. You can imagine generationally what that means. And I think it's just really important to, when we're looking at the past, not to have a pick and choose kind of, version of the past, but that we treat it with, everything that's there, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, right? So to me, it's very, as a historian, that I respect the kind of the choices that my, the people I study in the past made. But also, I've also thought about how I articulate my own identity now, right? So now instead of just saying Chinese American, I might say I'm Chinese American by way of Taiwan, right? To explain this journey my parents have made, right? From mainland China to Taiwan to the United States, which is not easy to fit on a little card or whatever, but I found that it's very difficult still for most Americans to understand any distinction between Taiwanese, Chinese, right? When they call Pei-mei a Taiwanese cookbook author, I'm like, well, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that you might claim her that way today, but that's not how she understood herself, right? So I think that we always have to be really careful about how we and pay attention to what the language used at the time. So as a historian, I think that's important. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, it's first and foremost, you're using sort of an actors category for.
Sorry, what?
Using actors category.
Yes, in part. And also, to be honest, when I spoke with my editor, she's like, you have to put Chinese in the title. Don't, people will be confused. They don't know Taiwan, they don't know where it is, they won't buy the book, right? So part of it is simply just a legibility issue, quite honestly, right? But mostly it's because that's what she used.
Edie, go ahead.
I'm also interested in the identity question, but instead of asking about your choice or the author Pei-mei's choice, I want to ask about the audience. Like, are the white children in Taiwan more interested in her show because they identify these kind of Chinese cooking versus the British children maybe reject this kind of cooking because they're not doing Taiwanese cooking?
Yeah.
And how much did she even adapt or incorporate Taiwanese cooking into her own?
Yeah, so I think that was a journey for her, right? That she wasn't interested at the start. When she first started her cooking, it was all about giving succor to the mainlanders, right? People who had left their homes, who couldn't eat the way that they were isn't to anymore, right? She isn't interested, doesn't talk about Taiwanese food, in part because she's not good at it. That's not her area of expertise. That's not why people would watch her on television, right? She would get people from Taiwan to demonstrate Taiwanese dishes when she wanted, to incorporate that. What's really interesting is that by her second or third volume, I can't remember, she has an entire section about Taiwanese cuisine, right, as its own thing, as another one of many, one of many Chinese regional cuisines, right, which is something that people may reject today. So I think she did undergo a kind of journey in the 80s. She did write a Taiwanese cookbook on Taiwanese food, but again, there's other better people to go to for that, so you wouldn't necessarily go to her. Right? There's other Taiwanese cooks and cookbook authors who would become more famous in their own right, like the owner of Xinye, for example, right? So I think there's that aspect to it, and I think that I'm sorry, I forgot the other aspect of the question.
The audience.
Oh, her audience, how they felt. Oh, yes. So that's a really, really interesting part because it was very important to me that I try to find some Taiwanese voices. And I will say they're not all uniform. Some, one Taiwanese friend said, she means nothing to me, right? It's just had nothing to do, right? Others told me, yeah, I cooked her food, I cooked Taiwanese food, I cook it all, right? And then other people, the best story that came out of this was that my university did a little a blurb in some college magazine or something like that about my research. And then I got an email from another professor at UNC, a nursing professor, who just wrote and said, oh, I was so glad to see this research you're doing on Pei-mei. I watched her a lot as a kid. So whenever, in the time I was writing the book, that anyone would write to me like that, I would always write back and say, do you mind if we have an interview? And so when I met her, she told me the most amazing story of herself as a young child in Tainan. She lived somewhere in the south, I don't remember, Kaohsiung, Tainan. And she lived in actually she was I take that back, she was in Taipei. But she was from a Taiwanese family. Her family was a little bit chaotic. Her father was in prison. Her mother had to clean houses to make ends meet, and she would have to bring the kids to clean houses with her. So they were kind of not well off. She didn't have a nice lunch to bring to school. Like she had plain noodles, if that, right? Or it was half empty, and other kids had all this nice food. And she was yelled at school for speaking Taiwanese, or she was afraid to ever speak Taiwanese because she was afraid of getting yelled at in school. But she said that she remembered very, very vividly watching Pei-mei on television. The story that she took away from her, and she knew that she was like a mainlander woman, right? But what she took away from watching her on TV was that here was this woman cooking all these dishes for foods that she couldn't possibly herself make or eat. But the kind of world that this woman inhabited, where every spoon had its place, every chopstick, everything was orderly, right? Everything was like she did it in 5 minutes, right? You felt comforted watching her. That was something that she carried with her for the rest of her life. It was a very, very powerful story. And I was amazed because, this woman basically, left home at 16, put herself through nursing school, is now a nursing professor in UNC. And it was just great that here was a story I had not anticipated and yet kind of came into the book and gave it such a heart and such a life to be able to tell that story. It's not what you think, right? So I can't say that Taiwanese people all rejected her uniformly or all embraced her. Some Taiwanese women took her classes, they loved her. Like, who can say, right? Sometimes it's a class thing. But the really powerful story to me was this woman's memory of having been a young child, in kind of not great circumstances. But what Pei-mei represented to her was something different than I could even have imagined. Not to say good or bad, like the distance, think in terms of power, in terms of place, in terms of all of those, the distance between those two women. But that's part of the story, right? So I think it gives kind of some nuance and shading to this kind of very kind of whatever official woman view of that post-war period.
I was hoping to ask you a question.
Sure.
I wanted to, one of the bubbles you had in the slides was about gender and about family. I suppose during this time period when we're beginning to see lots of changes in terms of gender roles, the political economy of Taiwan with greater participation of women in the labor force, and today predominantly dual income earning households. I'm curious about the reception from women specifically about changing gender roles in society at this time, and maybe even today how that might be shifting.
Yeah. So the really interesting thing for me to read about her, like she never uses the word feminist. She probably doesn't even know what that is, right? That doesn't appear. And she has this kind of neo-traditional face, right? She's cooking of all things, right? So sort of like old school or whatever. But and she never controlled her own money. Her husband controlled her earnings always. She had to ask him for permission to go abroad anywhere, right? She had a very traditional role in her own household. But despite all that, she still manages to create this public life and career for herself, right? In spite of that, within the realm of food, she becomes the face that everybody knows, right? And I found it so very interesting the way that I think her own ideas about her own role in her own marriage probably changed. Because in her autobiography, there's just one line that says, yes, some of the things may not seem very reasonable anymore, right? That some of the things her husband expected from her, like he's a big male chauvinist, because the only reason she learned to cook in the beginning was because she was a terrible cook and did not know how to cook, right? Her husband complained about her cooking because he would invite his mahjong buddies over and she would just make the same bad dishes all the time. And he would yell at her and like, why can't you make anything better? Why can't you change it up? Right? And she didn't say, well, go cook it yourself or like, forget it, figure it out yourself. She just quietly went about her way and trying to figure out how to do that, right? And it's funny because in the television version of the dramatic series, he's like such a nice guy and so supportive. I'm like, that is not in the autobiography at all. But I think that it's really interesting to me because she's such a kind of a complex figure, right? It's not just one thing or the other, but in fact, she's inhabiting lots of different spaces at the same time, partly because she's a product of her time and her upbringing. Yeah, I think it is interesting now that, anyone who goes to Taiwan now, you never need to cook if you don't want to. You can go out every day, you don't need, it's kind of a dying art really. So the only people who are choosing to cook are now because they want to, it's a hobby, you know. The only people you see going to wet markets are older people, you know, so it's a real question as to what, you know, what will remain of these kinds of traditions, right?
Michael, and then Dr. Michael Tsin.
So, going down these memory lanes, I was starting to think, when did I eat Chinese food? And so Pei-mei came into my life only after I'd been to Taiwan and was leaving Taiwan and found the only cookbook that seemed, quote, authentic, I'll come back to that in a second, that was in English. There were lots of cookbooks, but only this one had the pictures and the English. I'm just spacing out her name right now. Joyce Chen
Yes.
changed my life. I can remember my first chicken and walnuts. I was probably 10. My mom had bought a wok and a Chinese cookbook by Joyce Chen, and maybe even some special cooking chopsticks.
Yeah.
So she transformed Chinese food for Americans the way that Julia Child transformed French food. That would be my parallel. But this issue of authenticity, so why did I pick that book? It seemed more, quote, authentic. It wasn't what I was eating. It's almost like imperial food. It's very fancy, many of these dishes. Most people are not eating this on a regular basis. Can you talk about how, is this authentic food, or how do you approach this issue of authenticity? Someone talked about it early on with authenticity.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is I interviewed her daughter-in-law, who is also a cooking teacher, or her former daughter-in-law, and she said, yeah, you know, not only was the cookbook conceived of as like, it's like a course book, right? These are the dishes we're gonna teach you in the cooking school, right? So there was that because they needed notes or they needed something to go with it. But there was also the hope that they made it expensive and they made it in color because they wanted Americans to buy it and take it home and give it as a gift to whoever at home, right? By making a color, by making it in English, by boxing it, making a hardcover instead of a flimsy paperback. Right? They wanted it. So they put dishes in there that Americans would eat, like chop suey. There's a Peking duck recipe. I'm like, who makes Peking duck at home? Right? But there are also things that I used when I started learning how to cook. So I don't think it's all, I think most of it is pretty like home style cooking, right? It's some of it's tricky, but it's not necessarily like so far out of your range if you can cook a little bit. But what I think is interesting is that the cookbook, unlike cookbooks of today, which have a lot of talk about, oh, I found this dish and this whole story and blah, blah, all this stuff. It's like, nope, here's how you make the dish, here's the ingredients, like none of that chatter, right? It's just about cooking. And it also kind of assumes you know how to cook a little bit, right? Because the directions are pretty sparse. But I think some of people's tastes have changed, like with regard to MSG or the amount of oil or something like that, right? So people may have changed their tastes as well. But a lot of people, when you look online at comments, are like, yep, I still use it 20, 30 years later. Yep, I still make these recipes. Yep, it still works, right? So there's still a lot of fondness as well.
And there is a Taiwan chapter, am I remembering that?
In one of the later volumes, not in the
yeah.
first volume, but one of the later volumes. And she does have a Taiwanese cookbook, but it's all in Chinese, yeah. But authenticity as a food studies scholar, we have a whole class on that subject. So, we don't touch that one with a 10-foot pole, but
Yeah, Tsin.
Following up a little bit on the gender part of the conversation. So when I'm thinking about the food, I couldn't help thinking about the movie by An Li called Dream Food.
yes,
and
future
Women. I really like that piece. And in that movie, the father, he cooked in a restaurant while he passed down this technique to the second daughter, and she cooked in a household space.
Yeah.
So in your slides, like all those women, they're like in those pictures, they are cooking for household space.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, is there a hierarchy for restaurant and for household, and there's like a gender aspect in that, and does that lead to what you call the modern Chinese food? So what's the modern part and what's the gender part?
That's really great. That's a great observation and great question. A great movie too. Like always leaves you very hungry. But I don't think there's a hierarchy between restaurant cooking and home cooking unless you think there is one. You know what I'm saying? Like part of my reason for writing this book is to say it's not like just because it's restaurant food doesn't make it better. It's like that's just a different way and experience of food, right? So I don't want to buy into and yes, it's true that mostly men are in the spaces of restaurants, and traditionally speaking, it's a male profession, but it's a lowly one, right? Nobody looks up to chefs like we do now, like think, oh, the auteur kind of chef or the named chef. Still it's kind of a very kind of lowly profession in Chinese culture. But one of the things that she talks about in her, she was very, very proud of, was that, in the traditional model of apprentice to chef, you would just go work in somebody's kitchen and they would never teach you anything, right? They wouldn't want to tell you anything because they're worried you're going to steal the secrets and go open your own restaurant, right? So you would have to look, or they might put something in when you're not looking or whatever. Very different idea about what cooking is and what it means to teach someone to cook. So she was very proud of the fact that she never held anything back. She told her readers all the secrets. She was very upfront and very open about it, kind of subverting and wanting to teach women, right? So she's a woman teaching women. And the traditional model is a male chef having male apprentices. So I think in a restaurant setting, right? So I think that just the very act of it kind of subverts a kind of dynamic about, if you will, traditional Chinese transmission of culinary ideas. And I think that, so I don't believe myself that there's a hierarchy between restaurant food and home cooking. It's just different modes and models of it. And one of the great things is to, I end the book talking about one of my male friends from graduate school who is like a great cook, and I'm all about like men learning how to cook and, not making it just a women-only task. I think you see that much more now, right? Interest on the part of both men and women in learning how to cook because people want to eat well. And they know that it's not just a gendered task anymore.
Quick question from online. Does your book contain recipes?
This was another one we debated for a long time with my editor, like, should we put in recipes or not? We didn't, because putting recipes in, you have to make sure they work. Right, and then you have to, there's quite a lot of like, would I adapt it? I am not a very good cook. That's the other irony of writing this whole book. Like, I'm okay, but that's not really my space. But you would be amazed at the number of times people thought this was a cookbook and like picked it up. I'm like, in the first line it says this is a cultural history, right? So there aren't any recipes in it. But if people are interested, there's actually a fun blog that's still online, I think. It's called Pei-mei a Day, where the woman like basically was like the Julia Child, Julia blog or whatever. She didn't actually do a dish a day, but she kind of modernized a lot of her recipes, or kind of narrated through like cooking the various things, and she made a really nice blog about it. So there's ways you can look up her recipes online. You can't find hard to get cookbook itself. Yeah, but we thought about it, and I guess we just concluded no, we weren't going to put recipes in it, just because it's like I don't know what, there's a whole like thing. If you make cookbooks, like it has to be tested. It has to be like there's all this other stuff, the apparatus that goes with it. So that's not the space I inhabit. Yeah.
Right, other questions? Yes, in the left.
I had a question. I read on another source that potentially she used her dowry to help fund her tutorials.
Yes.
I'm wondering how was her show supported, and did she have control over, say, advertisers or whatever was used to make it happen?
Yeah, so she always claimed, that using her dowry was when she first started as a married woman, and she didn't know how to cook, and so she hired these restaurant chefs to teach her, because there weren't cooking schools, there weren't cookbooks. Like in the 50s, there's just not a lot of ways to learn how to cook if you don't have like learning from another woman or something like that. So that's what she used her dowry for. So she was well off, like make no mistake about it in terms of class. She's like middle class, upper middle class, her husband has a good job, all of that stuff. As far as how she made her money, interestingly, her daughter told me that the biggest source, or her son, I can't remember who told me, but the biggest source of income was not being on television. It was her cooking school, and it wasn't her cookbook, right? It was her cooking school that brought in the most income for her. I think the TV program probably drove students to the school, right? And likewise, the cookbook may have driven students to the school. But even things like she consulted once for China Airlines on their in-flight meals, for example. She got paid $1, 1 yuan for that job, cause it was an honor or something, or they were just depending on her to do her job or do her duty. So a lot of things did not actually translate into her making a ton of money, but she was well known. So I guess if you wanna think about that. In terms of advertisement, she did a lot of these collaborations. So she's in ads for gas stoves, for this Australian Meat Association. Her face was on this Tony ramen packet. There were different collaborations she did with different food companies and stuff, and consulting jobs. But I think the mainstream of income was really from the cooking school. And she always complained about how little she was paid for her television appearances, so it's just, again, part of it is just, you're gonna do this because Taiwan needs you to do it, so.
Other questions?
I'll just make a comment. You talked about how when the book first came out in '69, a big part of the audience were maybe the wives of American military or something like that. So I was in Taiwan, and there were quite a few Americans. There was, you could go there to study Chinese, and people came. You couldn't go to the mainland. People were doing interpretation. We thought the book was written for her.
Written for?
The expatriates who were scholars of China. It was 2 languages.
Right.
And we thought, you want to know the Chinese name for that ingredient?
Yeah.
You could look on both sides.
Exactly, yeah, and it's great, because I interviewed some of the former students, and one of the American men said exactly that, I knew enough Chinese, I could listen, but then here it is in English, I can take notes, so yeah, that's definitely.
And I brought it afterwards to Japan, but of course they use the same characters for the names of ingredients, so it's useful there too.
Well, I had another question.
Yeah.
Going back to your earlier comment about the song su huang,
Yeah.
you mentioned that it was strange that it had raisins. And I was wondering if you see a transformation in terms of the ingredients of the foods that Fu Pei-mei had used in her recipes. And does that reflect something broader about the cultural, social changes that we're seeing in Taiwan? Are there adjustments? Because, for example, I imagine that some foods, ingredients that many Westerners are used to in parts of China don't fit the ecology of Taiwan, where they have difficulty finding local ingredients.
Yeah.
Questions like that.
I think at first that was part of her motivation, what local substitutions could be used or something like that. But then eventually in Taiwan, all those industries, food industries, emerge, right, in Taiwan itself. So that the whatever, the local noodles or whatever that you've got in there that can be had in China, or soy sauce or whatever else. But I think what's really interesting is that it's adaptations like the use of frozen foods, right? She collaborates with frozen food companies, and now she's going to put frozen foods in some of her dishes, right, to demonstrate how you can cook with them. So I think the adaptations are not always the ones that we think about, but sometimes they're just these, or like she would herself say that, in the past, they dried things, they salted things, they preserved them in different ways. Today, they use cans and bottles and, retort packaging, the silver packaging that's vacuum sealed. Why not, right? And her vision of food was that Chinese food, someday I want it to be so easy that a family can go to a picnic and the woman can just open a box and they eat their picnic, right, without any effort on her part. And she always had this very forward-thinking vision that of all things she wanted to preserve was Chinese food. She was just worried that Western food would overtake, because in the 80s, McDonald's arrives, or fast food and that kind of thing. And she was worried that Western food and foreign tastes would overtake Chinese food. So she didn't care about how it was prepared so much. She was willing to make compromises there. But she just wanted to make sure people ate Chinese food of some kind in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's quite interesting. But she was always experimenting and always trying new things. And her daughter said she could taste a dish and kind of like guess at maybe how it was made. You know, a lot of good chefs can do that. They kind of can taste flavors and stuff. But yeah, definitely that's part of the continual renewal, because she also liked to claim that she never repeated a dish once on her TV program in 40 years. I'm like, well, not sure if that's true, but maybe, you know, that she demonstrated over 4,000 dishes or whatever over the time. That she certainly made up new things up, right? She kind of invented some new things, or you have this preparation with this kind of vegetable, now you try it with another or something like that.
Yes.
Can you tell us how you arrived at the title, Chop Fry Watch Learn?
Oh, yeah, so I actually had in mind the 4-character phrase, the 一句南语, what you mentioned, the title of Ang Lee's film. And so that's actually a Confucian 4-character phrase. And so I wanted to evoke the sense of a 4-character phrase to make it feel old and feel like Confucian or old. So people are like, oh, is that a saying? No, it's not a saying. I made it up. So the whole idea is that Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, 切炒观学 is a 4-character phrase I made up myself to give people the feeling of something old when actually it's totally invented and new and modern. And so that's kind of the whole idea in the book, that although we think about Chinese food as this ancient 5,000-year tradition, or some people talk about it that way anyway, you know, it's influenced by all these modern things like the electric rice cooker, like women being on television, like, you know, this transpacific migration, or the, you know, movement to Taiwan or whatever. That's all part of what we think of as modern Chinese food today. So that's kind of the modern part that I'm thinking about, not just in terms of ingredients or cooking styles, but in fact, all of those aspects. So that's, you know, where the title comes from, is my attempt to bury a message in there. And I also thought it was really important that the cover itself be bilingual. Right? It's a bilingual book that I'm writing about. I wanted Chinese characters on the front. I insisted on that, you know. But once I took a long time in trying to figure out what the title would be. But once we figured it out, my editor was like, that's it. You know, we're going to go with that one. So, yeah.
Great story. Okay, we only have about 4 minutes left. I was hoping to, you know, ask you about what you're working on after this. And also share with us where we can buy the book.
Oh, yeah. You can buy the book on any, you know, online platform. It's in a lot of bookstores, especially if you have any kind of cookbook store near you. A lot of them have it too, on Amazon and any of the other platforms you might go on. So I am working now on putting together an edited volume on modern Chinese foodways. Or sorry, that's what I just did on global Chinese foodways. Which I want to talk about how Chinese food has been adapted in different places all over the world by different diasporas. You know, it's in Antarctica now as well, at the, you know, Chinese station there. And also talking about kind of the global influence of Chinese consumers now on the global markets and global production. So it'll have, you know, I'm planning on inviting a bunch of scholars to North Carolina to work on that. So that's my immediate project. But I'm cooking up, I have to say, another project that will be about Chinese food and history in some capacity, but it's still kind of in the like early fermenting stages. So I'm still thinking about that one.
Appropriate use of
That's right.
puns. Yeah. All right, let's give one last thank you.